Welcome back to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and in today's episode, we're traveling to Italy to uncover how questions of national identity, race, and history have shaped the country we know today. We are joined by Professor Silvana Patriarca, a historian of modern Italy and modern Europe, and the author of Numbers and Nationhood, Italian Vices, and Race in Post-Fascist Italy. Her work looks at the fascinating and sometimes uncomfortable ways Italians have thought about themselves and others, from the 19th century Risorgimento to the aftermath of fascism. Professor Patriarca, thank you so much for joining me here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Firstly, what first drew you to study modern Italian history, and especially discovering themes like nationalism and identity?
Yeah, I was born in Italy and I lived there for several years. So I studied there. I went to university at college level there, and so I was interested in the history of my first country. And when I came here to do a doctorate in the US, I decided that I would continue to study the history of Italy, and in particular the history of Italian nationalism, because at that time, which was in the late 80s, early 90s, nationalism was becoming salient again in Italy, in Italian society. There was a movement that wanted the division of Italy, I mean, the autonomy for the northern regions versus the rest of the country. And there was a reaction to that movement, which took, some kind of nationalist meaning at that point, right? Fighting the regionalism and internal regionalism. And at the same time, also, academia was becoming more interested in questions of national identity, nationhood, the creation of new states. At the beginning of the 90s, there was a whole big change in Europe because of the fall of the Soviet Union, the creation of new countries, and so on. So, it was that moment in particular. And then I got always more interested in the theme because I see that it's quite important also in American society, which, the US became my second country. So I see, parallels and distinctions that you can make in the history of these countries. So I'm interested in that for, again, a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and speaking on that, for a lot of younger listeners who may know Italy mostly through its food, its fashion, and tourism, why is Italy's modern history such an important case for understanding Europe as a whole?
Well, Italy can be seen a bit of the microcosm of Europe because of its internal diversity, also cultural, geographical diversity, also, the changing positions of the country in Europe from being in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period in the Renaissance, quite an important center in Europe, and then which then underwent a decline. And then it sort of came back later as a nation state in the late 19th century, in the 20th century. So there is an interesting, you can observe the ups and downs of this country. And then you can also think about somehow learning about the fragility of democracy in the 20th century, when Italy, right, as a new, recently created democratic nation by, World War I, underwent a period of great difficulties, which led to the rise of fascism.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's instructive to see how it's easy to lose a democratic regime and fall into a dictatorship. So it can give, yeah, I think sort of lessons also to the present. And Italy sort of reconquered its democracy, actually a more advanced democracy after the fall of fascism. And today it is, I would say, solidly democratic, even though it's a country with its own problems. But the constitution that the anti-fascist wrote after the fall of fascism gave it certain, important defenses against falling against into a dictatorship.
And speaking of that unification of Italy in the 19th century, before World War II, before World War One. Could you explain what the Risorgimento was and why it's such a crucial moment in Italian history?
Yeah, the Risorgimento, the term itself means a resurgence, and it's a term that circulated in the first half of the 19th century among the patriotic activists, right? Those who wanted to create an Italian state. It's a term that, again, means resurgence. So the idea being that Italy had always existed, but it had, it underwent a period of decline, and at that point, it needed to be recreated, right? So without the Risorgimento, which is a struggle for unification and independence, there would be no nation state. So it's sort of fundamental for understanding the creation of these nation states, the tensions that existed in the country, but also some of the issues or problems that Italy still has today, the way in which Italy was created as a state then has left a legacy, for example, in the divisions between North and South, right? The creation of what Italians call a Southern question, meaning the annexation of the South to the Italian state that led to, policies that were not favoring the South and the persistent, let's say, underdevelopment of the South vis-a-vis the nation. It still goes back to that period of formation of the Italian state, right? So if you want to understand some of the issues that still exist in Italy today, you have to go back to that period and to
And
the way, very different regions were put together to create a new state.
so learning about the Risorgimento kind of gives us a foundation and a building block that helps us understand the future of Italian history.
Exactly, exactly. It's very important. It's still a period which is, or a history that somehow is even today also contested because not everybody came together harmoniously in the
Yeah.
creation of this new state, right? There were many different states, many different constituencies. So it was not, a period of easy, process of unification.
Yeah,
Right.
and
So, but it's the founding block, as you say, right? What we need to know to then understand what happens later.
yeah, and on that, in the 19th century, like how did Italians create that sense of national unity?
Yeah, they created some myths about themselves, right? The idea that they existed, for example, as a people already in antiquity, in the Roman period or
Yeah.
even earlier, with the Etruscans. Even though, the history of Italy is very complicated over the centuries, there have been invasions and so on. They wanted to believe, right? They believed that they, as a people, they went back to that kind of glorious past of the Romans. And the Catholic says, Italy is also a great nation that has given, the papacy to the world. These kind of things, these kind of stories that simplify a much more complex history. So it's a kind of, several stories also about, for example, the great writers and poets of the Middle Ages, Dante, Petrarch. So they just say we gave a kind of civilization and we gave some important, signs and means of civilization to the world, right? So they create, and this is quite common among different countries, right? That when they want to foster a sense of national identity, they come up with these stories about themselves, which are often great exaggerations, okay, or
Yeah.
even completely invented stories, right? That have very little to do with what went on in the past.
Using these myths and stories as a way to unify Italy, to make all the citizens feel Italian.
Right, to say we all come from these same ancestors, right? These were, yeah. So to overcome the divisions at the time that existed. So and this is also what was taught to children in the classrooms, right?
Got it. Yeah.
This kind of history that was very simplified to create this sense of unity in a rather divided country.
Yeah, and more than that, in your book, Numbers and Nationhood, you discuss how statistics were used to shape ideas of who counted as part of the nation and who didn't. How did numbers influence the way Italians thought about themselves and others?
These patriotic, what I call the patriotic statisticians of the Risorgimento, they wanted to show that Italy would be a viable state. They had this idea that, it was big enough, it had a fairly large population. At that time, the idea of the legitimacy of a state rested on the idea of a common culture, language, but also, the size. So there was this idea that Italy could become a really viable state. And they also, compared through numbers what they consider, the level of civilization of the different regions. And they wanted to show that the regions that were more prosperous were, for example, in the north. And so the new Italy should, try to apply what made those regions more prosperous to also the rest. So they wanted to use statistics and statistical knowledge to show also the way of a good governance. All right, so they sort of use these numbers to provide directions and also to use for sort of propaganda purposes, to say, we inhabit a country which has already all the elements to be a nation too, right? We inhabit a peninsula which should become a country of its own.
Oh, that's
And so
interesting.
they use all sorts of tools, and statistics for these people was an important tool, let's say, for rational government, data, right? So
Yeah.
these were, people who had, at the time, were known as positivists, meaning they wanted positive knowledge as a basis for, any kind of scientific observation. Okay, so positive knowledge meant numbers too, right? Not
Yeah.
only qualitative observations, but also quantitative data.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, I guess I never thought about that these statistics, these numbers could also be used as a sort of propaganda for Italy.
Yeah,
And
it was new for me as I wrote this book to understand to the extent to which they believed in the possibility of a kind of a scientific way of governing the people.
yeah,
In with the representative institutions, but the collection of information about themselves was important, an important part of self-government, which we still have today, right? As we think about the importance of having good statistics
yeah,
in,
absolutely.
in our society, understanding, right, how policies also should be based on that, right? Should be based on some kind of good data.
Yeah. And in Race and Post-Fascist Italy, you argue that racial thinking didn't end in 1945. Could you share an example of how these ideas like persisted after the fall of Mussolini in World War II?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I was interested in seeing this persistence because I noticed that Italians think, although they are peoples that, have very different origins and they live you think about the peninsula at the center of the Mediterranean. So there have been exchanges with all sorts of people, North Africa or Africa in general. I mean, Italy has also a colonial past, but they thought about it, they constructed themselves as whites. And I was thinking, fascism introduced openly racist policies. And I was convinced that even when they abrogated these policies with the collapse of fascism, certain ideas that had developed in that context, and even before with colonialism, continued to permeate the thinking of many people in Italian society. So I looked at the way in which they treated the children of Italian white women and non-white allied soldiers, yeah, who were in Italy during the occupation, during World War II and the
Yeah.
occupation by the Allies, right? So I noticed how certain ideas of Black inferiority, continue to exist in that context. These children were, often mistreated, represented in negative ways, stereotyped, and so on. So I figure that it's sort of important to understand that there was a change of regime, right, of political regime from fascist to democratic Italy. But for many people, that had not implied also a change of mentality in the way they saw themselves, they saw others. Also because there was not an open debate about, or let's say, a questioning of that past. They say, oh, it's all the fascists, that did that. As if the others were, many Italians were not involved in this kind of discourse, racist discourse and racist practices in the colonies and so on. So I was interested in that, right? In showing how also today Italians continue to have difficulties accepting the fact that there is immigration from non-European countries and that, there should not be discrimination on the basis of race, right?
Yeah.
And yet there is still today, right? So this is what, I see these kind of continuities in history that troubles also our present, how we deal with our present.
Yeah. And I mean, as you were saying, it's not as if fascism was a switch on and off. When there was fascism, there was racism. Fascism was just a way for people to openly express that racism. And
Exactly.
and even
Mhm.
without fascism, it doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. It's still an underlying part of society.
Exactly. And even if it becomes unacceptable to express those ideas officially, right, so that racism disappears officially, there is this kind of underlying, right,
Yeah.
structure of mentality.
Yeah.